Welcome back to our channel. The mission patch hit the conference table with a soft thud, and 74-year-old Commander Robert "Bob" E. Sterling's world collapsed. Apollo 21, Freedom's Shadow. 3 names embroidered in gold thread that officially never existed, representing a lunar mission that never happened, flown by astronauts who were never there. But Bob Sterling had been there. He had walked on the far side of the moon for 3 impossible days in July 1971, and he had sworn to take that secret to his grave. Until now. Where the hell did you get that? Bob's voice cracked as his weathered astronaut hands trembled above the patch. The woman across from him, Sarah Chen, claimed to be processing his routine NASA pension paperwork. But nothing about this interview was routine, and the mission patch sitting between them proved that 50 years of carefully guarded silence was about to shatter like lunar rock under a hammer. Sarah's dark eyes never left Bob's face as she spoke. "We found it in a box of classified materials that were recently declassified under a congressional oversight investigation, along with mission logs, flight recordings, photographs, and technical specifications that shouldn't exist. Your name appears on several documents, Commander Sterling, as pilot of a lunar module that NASA has no official record of ever building, let alone launching." Bob felt his chest tighten. For 5 decades, he had lived with the knowledge that someone, someday, would come asking questions about the 3 days that changed everything he believed about space, about Earth, and about humanity's place in a universe far stranger and more dangerous than anyone imagined. He had rehearsed his denials, prepared his deflections, crafted a dozen different ways to redirect curious investigators away from the truth. But he had never prepared for this moment, when the physical proof of Apollo 21 would be laid out in front of him like an accusation. The mission patch seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. Bob remembered the day they had received those patches, just 2 weeks before launch, in a secure facility buried 3 levels beneath the Johnson Space Center. Unlike the Apollo missions that captured the world's attention with live television broadcasts and ticker-tape parades, Apollo 21 had been planned in absolute secrecy, launched under cover of a routine military satellite deployment, and executed by 3 astronauts who were sworn to never speak of what they discovered on coordinates that didn't appear on any public lunar map. But the most terrifying part wasn't what they had found on the moon. The most terrifying part was that it had found them first. "Commander Sterling," Sarah said, her voice gentler now, "I know this must be overwhelming, but there are people who desperately need to know what happened on that mission. Your grandson Jake is leading the Mars Life Support Program, and frankly, we're failing. Every prototype fails, every system breaks down, and we can't figure out why. But some of the technical specifications we found in the Apollo 21 files suggest that solutions to these problems were discovered 50 years ago." Bob's heart clenched at the mention of Jake. His grandson, now 28 years old, had followed his grandfather's path into aerospace engineering and was currently working 18-hour days, trying to solve problems that had stumped NASA's best minds for decades. Jake was developing life support systems for the planned Mars colony, battling challenges that seemed impossible with current technology. What Jake didn't know, what nobody knew, was that those challenges had already been overcome, using technology that Bob had personally operated on the lunar surface half a century ago. Technology that wasn't human. Bob closed his eyes and was immediately transported back to that cramped lunar module as it descended toward coordinates that Mission Control had whispered to them in coded transmissions. He could feel the vibration of engines that shouldn't have been able to function in the vacuum of space. Hear the crackle of radio communications with a Mission Control that consisted of only 5 people, all sworn to the same deadly secrecy that had bound him for 50 years. He could remember the exact moment when his boots touched the lunar regolith, and he saw what they had come to investigate, rising from the surface like metallic flowers blooming in the eternal darkness of the moon's far side. Structures, clearly artificial, definitely not human. And they were active. "I can't," Bob whispered, opening his eyes to meet Sarah's gaze. "I gave my word to people who are dead now, but the promise still matters. There are things about Apollo 21 that could destroy everything if they came out wrong." "Your word to whom?" Sarah leaned forward. Commander Charles Morrison died in a car accident in 1985. Flight engineer Kevin Walsh had a heart attack 8 years ago. Mission director Harrison Webb retired in 1995 and has advanced Alzheimer's. You're the only person left alive who remembers what really happened out there. And meanwhile, your grandson is slowly killing himself trying to solve problems that you could help him understand. Bob felt the weight of 50 years of silence pressing down on his chest, like a collapsed lunar module. For decades, he had carried the knowledge alone, watching as NASA poured billions of dollars into research programs that were doomed to fail because they were missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. He had attended Jake's graduation from MIT, had watched his brilliant grandson join NASA with stars in his eyes and the dream of sending humans to Mars, had seen the boy's excitement slowly turn to frustration as prototype after prototype failed for reasons no one could explain. The solutions were locked in Bob's memory and in a vault buried so deep beneath the Johnson Space Center that most people didn't know it existed. But they were also locked behind an oath that Bob had sworn not just to his government, but to entities whose power and intelligence made human technology look like stone tools. "You don't understand," Bob said, his voice stronger now. "The things we discovered on Apollo 21 weren't just scientific curiosities or advanced technology. They were evidence that Earth has been under observation for thousands of years. The structures we found on the moon were left by intelligences so far beyond human comprehension that just knowing about them could fundamentally alter the course of human civilization." Sarah was taking notes, but Bob could see the skepticism in her eyes. That was the problem with the younger generation. They had grown up with science fiction movies and NASA press releases that made space exploration seem routine, predictable, manageable. They had no concept of how fragile human confidence really was, or how quickly the certainty of being alone in the universe could transform into the terror of being watched. "Commander," Sarah said carefully, "I understand that you might have encountered something unusual during the mission, but we're talking about life and death situations. The Mars colonization program is humanity's next great step, and if Apollo 21 discovered technology that could save lives, don't you think? Save lives." Bob interrupted, his voice sharp with 50 years of suppressed emotion. "Sarah, what we found on the moon wasn't just advanced technology. It was a test. An evaluation system left by beings who have been monitoring the development of intelligent species throughout the galaxy for millions of years. Apollo 21 wasn't a secret mission to investigate anomalous structures. Apollo 21 was humanity's first examination, and we barely passed." The silence in the conference room stretched like the vacuum of space. Sarah's pen had stopped moving, and Bob could see her trying to process the implications of what he had just revealed. The truth about Apollo 21 was bigger and stranger than any government conspiracy, any cover-up, any secret that human beings were capable of conceiving. "An examination." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Bob nodded grimly. "The beings who left those structures on the moon have been watching human development for centuries, waiting to see if we would develop the wisdom and cooperation necessary to join a galactic community of intelligent species. The technology we encountered wasn't just advanced. It was responsive, interactive, designed to evaluate our readiness for contact with civilizations that exist on scales we can barely imagine." Bob paused, remembering the 3 days he and his crewmates had spent in direct interface with technology that operated according to principles of physics that human science was still centuries away from understanding. The learning process had been both exhilarating and terrifying, requiring them to expand their consciousness beyond the limited perspectives that had defined human existence since the species first looked up at the stars. "Charlie, Kevin, and I spent 72 hours connected to that technology," Bob continued, his voice growing stronger as the words that had been locked inside him for 50 years finally found release. It wasn't just communication. It was direct information transfer, consciousness expansion, a download of knowledge that included technical specifications for technologies beyond our current understanding, historical records of galactic civilizations that rose and fell before Earth, even had multicellular life, and philosophical concepts that challenged every assumption we had about consciousness, reality, and humanity's destiny in the universe. Sarah was staring at him with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. And this technology could help with Mars colonization. Sarah, this technology could revolutionize human civilization overnight. The life support systems your grandson is trying to develop. Child's play compared to what we learned about manipulating matter and energy at the quantum level. Radiation shielding for Mars missions. Trivial when you understand how to adjust the fundamental properties of atomic structures. Communication delays between Earth and Mars. Non-existent when you're tapping into information networks that transcend the normal limitations of space and time. Bob stood up and walked to the window of the conference room, looking out at the sprawling NASA complex, where thousands of brilliant minds worked every day to push the boundaries of human knowledge, unaware that the most significant breakthrough in the history of science was sitting in the memory of one old astronaut who had promised to keep it secret. But here's the catch, Bob said, turning back to face Sarah. The technology only activates for species that demonstrate certain characteristics: cooperation over competition, wisdom over aggression, respect for life over exploitation of resources, and the ability to see beyond tribal conflicts to the larger community of consciousness that exists throughout the universe. In 1971, humanity hadn't developed those characteristics. The question is whether we have them now. What do you think? Sarah asked. Bob considered the question carefully. In 1971, the world had been divided by the Cold War, threatened by nuclear annihilation, and just beginning to understand the environmental consequences of industrial civilization. The Apollo 21 crew had unanimously agreed that humanity wasn't ready for technology that could reshape the planet overnight, technology that could make nuclear weapons obsolete, technology that could solve every energy and environmental problem facing the species. But 50 years later, international cooperation on space exploration was routine, environmental awareness was widespread, and the existential challenges facing humanity required solutions that might only be possible with knowledge that transcended current scientific limitations. I think we're about to find out, Bob said. Because there's something I haven't told you yet, something that changes everything. Sarah leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. The structures we found on the moon weren't dormant relics, Bob said. They were monitoring stations, communication nodes connected to a vast network of intelligence that spans the entire galaxy. And according to the information we received during our 3 days of contact, they're designed to reactivate automatically when a monitored species reaches certain developmental milestones. What kind of milestones? Bob smiled grimly. The development of interplanetary colonization capabilities. The ability to establish permanent human settlements beyond Earth. Sarah, Jake's Mars mission isn't just another step in human space exploration. It's the trigger that will reactivate the network, the signal that will let the galactic community know that humanity is ready for the next phase of contact. Sarah's face went pale. Are you saying that the Mars mission will automatically trigger contact with extraterrestrial intelligence? I'm saying that the signals you mentioned finding in the Apollo 21 files aren't historical records, Bob replied. They're current transmissions. The network has been monitoring our Mars preparations, and it's getting ready to make contact whether we're prepared for it or not. The implications hung in the air like lunar dust settling in Earth's gravity. Bob could see Sarah struggling to process the magnitude of what he was revealing, the way the scope of human space exploration had suddenly expanded beyond anything she had imagined possible. There's more, Bob said, returning to his seat. The beings who created this network don't just observe and evaluate developing species. They guide them. The technical problems Jake is encountering with his life support systems aren't accidents or design flaws. They're intentional challenges, tests designed to push human engineering to the point where we're forced to think beyond our current limitations. You mean the failures are deliberate? The failures are educational, Bob corrected. The network is teaching us, pushing us to develop the kinds of innovative thinking that will be necessary for successful interaction with galactic-level intelligence. Every failed prototype is a lesson. Every setback is guidance toward solutions that require us to expand our understanding of physics, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of reality. Bob pulled out his wallet and extracted a small, worn photograph. Himself, Charlie Morrison, and Kevin Walsh standing in front of the lunar module, grinning like kids on Christmas morning. But if you looked carefully at the background of the photo, you could see the edge of something that didn't belong on any lunar landscape. The curved wall of a structure that rose from the moon's surface like a metallic mountain, covered in patterns that shifted and flowed like living light. This is the only photograph of the Apollo 21 discovery that wasn't confiscated by the classification board, Bob said, sliding the picture across the table. Charlie smuggled it out in his personal gear, and he gave it to me the night before he died. Look at the background, Sarah. Look at what we were really standing next to. Sarah picked up the photograph and squinted at the details. Bob watched her expression change as she realized what she was seeing. The unmistakable outline of artificial structures that were clearly not built by human hands, technology that seemed to pulse with its own internal energy, even in the static image of an old photograph. "My God," she whispered, "how big were these structures?" "The one in the photograph was about the size of the Capitol building," Bob said. But it was just the tip of a complex that extended deep beneath the lunar surface. The full installation was approximately the size of Manhattan, connected by tunnels and chambers that seemed to exist partially outside normal three-dimensional space. Partially outside normal space. What does that mean? Bob smiled at the question. It was the same one he had asked 50 years ago, when the reality of what they had discovered began to challenge every assumption about physics, about the nature of space and time, about the limitations that human science had accepted as absolute. It means that the beings who built these structures have mastered technologies that allow them to manipulate the fundamental dimensions of reality, Bob explained. They can create spaces that are larger on the inside than the outside, establish communication networks that operate faster than light, and exist as pure consciousness that can inhabit and control matter at will. Sarah was staring at the photograph as if it might suddenly come to life. "And they've been watching us. They've been guiding us," Bob corrected. "Every major breakthrough in human space technology, every innovation that brought us closer to interplanetary capability, was influenced by subtle information transfers from the network. The beings who created this system have been shepherding human development for centuries, waiting for us to reach the point where we could join their community as equals rather than subjects. And you think that point is now?" Bob nodded. Jake's Mars mission represents the final test. If humanity can establish a successful permanent colony on another planet, if we can demonstrate that we've developed the cooperation, wisdom, and respect for life that characterizes advanced galactic civilizations, then the network will fully activate. We'll gain access to technologies that will revolutionize human civilization, but will also inherit the responsibility of helping to guide other developing species throughout the galaxy. "And if we fail the test?" Bob's expression grew serious. "Then the network remains dormant, the contact opportunity passes, and humanity continues to develop in isolation. We'll eventually reach Mars and establish colonies using our own primitive technology, but we'll face every challenge alone, without guidance, and some of those challenges may prove insurmountable." Sarah set down the photograph and looked directly at Bob. "Commander, if what you're telling me is true, then Jake and his team need to know. They need to understand what they're really working toward. They need to understand more than that," Bob replied. "They need to prepare for the possibility that their mission success will trigger the most significant event in human history. First contact with galactic intelligence won't be a dramatic arrival of alien spacecraft. It will be a gradual awakening of technology that has been dormant on our own moon for 50 years, waiting for humanity to prove that we're ready to join a community of consciousness that spans the entire universe." Bob paused, thinking about Jake working late into the night at NASA headquarters, struggling with technical problems that had solutions locked away in classified files and in the memories of one old astronaut who had sworn to keep them secret. His grandson was brilliant, dedicated, and completely unaware that the future of human civilization might depend on his ability to solve challenges that were designed to test not just his engineering skills, but his capacity to think beyond the limitations of current human knowledge. "There's something else Jake needs to know," Bob said. "Something about the nature of the test itself. The life support systems he's trying to develop aren't just meant to keep humans alive on Mars. They're meant to demonstrate that humanity has developed the kind of integrated thinking that considers the welfare of all life, not just human survival." "What do you mean?" Bob leaned back in his chair, remembering the moment during Apollo 21 when the true scope of the test had become clear. The beings who created the network evaluate species based on their ability to create technologies that enhance life rather than merely exploit resources. Jake's life support systems won't work until they're designed to support not just human colonists, but entire ecosystems. The Mars colony isn't meant to be just a human outpost. It's meant to be a thriving community of life that demonstrates humanity's commitment to fostering biological diversity throughout the galaxy. Sarah was taking notes again, but Bob could see that she was struggling to keep up with the implications of what he was revealing. The scope of human space exploration had suddenly expanded beyond anything that current NASA planning had considered possible. "Commander," she said finally, "if you're willing to share this information with Jake and the Mars team, how do we proceed? This isn't just a matter of declassifying some old mission files. You're talking about revealing information that could fundamentally change human civilization." Bob stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Jake's car was probably parked somewhere among the hundreds of vehicles belonging to NASA employees who had no idea that their work was part of a test designed by intelligences beyond human comprehension. "We proceed carefully," Bob said. "First, we bring Jake into this conversation privately. He deserves to know what he's really working on, and he needs to understand the full scope of the challenge he's trying to solve. Second, we contact the key members of the Mars colonization team and start preparing them for the possibility that their mission has implications that extend far beyond establishing a human footpost on another planet. And third." Bob turned back to face Sarah, his expression filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that had been building inside him for 50 years. "Third, we start preparing humanity for the possibility that we're about to become part of something much larger than ourselves. The signals from the moon aren't just random transmissions. They're invitations to join a community of intelligence that has been waiting 50 years for us to be ready." Bob walked back to the conference table and picked up the mission patch, holding it between his fingers like a small piece of the future. "Jake gets off work in about 2 hours. I think it's time for his grandfather to tell him a story about 3 astronauts who took a trip to the moon that officially never happened, and what they found there that's been waiting half a century to help humanity take its next step into a universe that's far more alive and welcoming than we ever dared to imagine." As Bob Sterling walked out of the NASA conference room, he felt lighter than he had in 50 years. The secret of Apollo 21 was about to become the foundation of humanity's greatest adventure, and Jake Sterling was going to be at the very center of it all. Bob could hardly wait to see his grandson's face when he learned that the impossible challenges he was trying to solve weren't just engineering problems. They were humanity's final examination for membership in a galactic community that had been patiently waiting for Earth to prove it was ready to join the larger conversation of consciousness that connected every intelligent species in the universe. The truth about what 3 astronauts had found on the far side of the moon was about to change everything. And for the first time in 50 years, Bob Sterling was ready to let it. 2 hours later, Bob sat in his truck outside NASA's Building 4, watching employees stream out of the complex as the evening shift ended. He had called Jake 20 minutes ago, asking if they could meet for dinner at their usual spot, Antonio's Italian restaurant, the same place where Bob had celebrated Jake's acceptance to MIT, his graduation, and his hiring by NASA. Tonight would be different. Tonight Bob would finally tell his grandson the truth about why every life support prototype was failing, and why the solutions required thinking that went beyond anything taught in engineering school. Jake emerged from the building looking exhausted, his dark hair disheveled, and his NASA polo shirt wrinkled from another 18-hour day battling impossible technical challenges. At 28, Jake Sterling had his grandfather's intelligent eyes and stubborn determination, but he also carried the weight of responsibility that came with leading humanity's most ambitious space exploration project. Bob's heart clenched as he watched his grandson trudge toward his car, knowing that Jake was slowly killing himself trying to solve problems that had been designed to be unsolvable with current human technology. Bob started his truck and followed Jake across Houston to Antonio's, a family-owned restaurant that had been serving astronauts and NASA employees since the Mercury program. The walls were covered with photographs of space missions, autographed pictures of astronauts, and newspaper clippings chronicling America's conquest of space. But there were no pictures of Apollo 21, no newspaper stories about freedom's shadow, no recognition of the mission that had discovered the most important secret in human history. Jake was already seated at their usual corner booth when Bob arrived, staring at his phone with the kind of intense concentration that meant he was reviewing technical specifications even during dinner. Bob slid into the seat across from his grandson and signaled the waitress for 2 beers, the same brands they had been ordering together since Jake turned 21. "You look terrible," Bob said, studying his grandson's face. Dark circles under his eyes, stress lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago, the pallor that came from spending too many hours under fluorescent lights and not enough time in sunlight. Jake looked up from his phone with a tired smile. "Thanks for the pep talk, Grandpa." Just what I needed to hear. He set the phone aside and leaned back in the booth. "We had another catastrophic failure today. The atmospheric processing system that we've been developing for 3 years just completely shut down during testing. No warning, no gradual degradation, just total system collapse. It's like something is actively working against us." Bob felt his chest tighten. That was exactly what was happening, but not in the way Jake imagined. The technology monitoring human Mars preparations wasn't trying to sabotage human efforts. It was teaching humanity to think beyond the limitations of current science, pushing human engineering toward solutions that would demonstrate readiness for galactic-level contact. "Tell me about the failure," Bob said, genuinely curious about the technical details. For 50 years, he had watched NASA struggle with problems that could be solved instantly with the knowledge locked in his memory, but he had never been able to help without revealing the source of his information. Jake launched into a detailed explanation of atmospheric processing systems, molecular filtration, and the specific ways that his carefully designed equipment kept failing at critical moments. Bob listened with the attention of someone who understood both the engineering challenges Jake was describing and the larger purpose they served. Every failure was a lesson. Every setback was guidance toward solutions that required fundamental shifts in how humans thought about technology, consciousness, and the relationship between life and the larger universe. "It's almost like the equipment is trying to teach us something," Jake said, unknowingly echoing the truth that Bob had carried for 50 years. "Every time we think we've solved one problem, a new challenge emerges that requires us to completely rethink our approach. It's pushing us toward solutions that integrate biological systems with mechanical ones, toward technologies that work with natural processes rather than trying to control them." Bob nodded, impressed by his grandson's intuitive understanding of what the alien technology was trying to teach human engineers. "That's good thinking, Jake. What if the failures aren't random? What if they're pointing you toward a different approach entirely?" "What do you mean?" Bob paused, choosing his words carefully. The conversation he was about to have would change Jake's understanding of everything: his work, his purpose, his place in a universe that was far stranger and more interconnected than current human science acknowledged. "Jake," Bob said finally, "what would you say if I told you that the problems you're trying to solve have already been solved? That there are technologies that could make your atmospheric processing systems work perfectly, but that those technologies have been classified at levels so high that most people don't even know they exist?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I'd say that if such technologies existed, NASA would be using them instead of watching our best engineers slowly lose their minds trying to reinvent the wheel. The Mars colonization project is too important for bureaucratic games, Grandpa. If someone had solutions to these problems, they would share them. What if the reasons for classification went beyond bureaucracy? Bob asked. What if the technologies came from sources that would fundamentally challenge everything we think we know about human civilization, about our place in the universe, about what's possible with scientific development? Jake's expression grew serious. His grandfather had never talked like this before, never hinted at knowledge beyond his official NASA career. Grandpa, what are you trying to tell me? Bob reached into his wallet and pulled out the mission patch, setting it on the table between them like a challenge. I'm trying to tell you about Apollo 21, Jake. About a mission that officially never happened, flown by astronauts who were never there, to discover things that changed everything we thought we knew about space, about Earth, and about why your life support systems keep failing despite your best efforts. Jake picked up the mission patch and studied it closely. The embroidery was clearly genuine NASA work, the kind of detailed craftsmanship that went into official mission patches. But the mission designation and crew names were completely unfamiliar, and Jake knew the history of the Apollo program better than most historians. Apollo 21 never flew, Jake said carefully. The Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in 1972. There was no Apollo 21. Officially, you're correct, Bob replied. Unofficially, Apollo 21 launched on July 15, 1971, under cover of a routine military satellite deployment. The crew consisted of Commander Charles Morrison, flight engineer Kevin Walsh, and lunar module pilot Robert Sterling. We spent 3 days on the far side of the moon investigating structures that had been detected by previous Apollo missions but never officially reported. Jake set down the mission patch and stared at his grandfather with a mixture of confusion and growing excitement. You're saying you flew a secret lunar mission? Grandpa, that's impossible. The documentation for every Apollo mission is public record. There's no way NASA could have hidden an entire lunar landing. NASA didn't hide it, Bob said. It was classified by agencies that exist at levels above NASA, above the Department of Defense, above most government officials. The decision to classify Apollo 21 was made by people who understood that what we discovered on the moon could fundamentally alter the course of human civilization if it were revealed before humanity was ready to handle the implications. Bob reached into his jacket and pulled out the worn photograph of himself, Charlie Morrison, and Kevin Walsh standing in front of their lunar module. But instead of the familiar lunar landscape in the background, the photograph showed the edge of something that clearly didn't belong on any natural celestial body. The curved wall of a structure that rose from the moon's surface like a metallic mountain, covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow even in the static image. This is the only photograph of the Apollo 21 discovery that wasn't confiscated, Bob said, sliding the picture across the table. Charlie smuggled it out in his personal equipment, and he gave it to me the night before he died in that car accident. Look at the background, Jake. Look at what we were really standing next to. Jake picked up the photograph and examined it closely. Bob watched his grandson's expression change as he realized what he was seeing, unmistakable evidence of artificial structures that were clearly not built by human hands, technology that seemed to pulse with its own internal energy, even in the faded colors of an old photograph. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered. Grandpa, what is that thing? That's what we went to Apollo 21 to investigate, Bob replied. Anomalous structures detected by Apollo 15 and 16, but never officially reported. What you're looking at is just the visible portion of a complex that extended deep beneath the lunar surface, connected by tunnels and chambers that seem to exist partially outside normal three-dimensional space. Jake was staring at the photograph as if it might suddenly come to life. How big were these structures? The main installation was approximately the size of Manhattan, Bob said. But size wasn't the most remarkable thing about it. The most remarkable thing was that it was active, responsive, designed to interface with human consciousness in ways that challenged everything we thought we knew about the nature of intelligence, about the relationship between mind and matter, about what was possible with technology that had been developed according to principles we were only beginning to understand. Bob paused, watching Jake struggle to process the implications of what he was seeing and hearing. The truth about Apollo 21 was bigger and stranger than any government conspiracy, any corporate cover-up, any secret that human beings were normally capable of conceiving. It touched on fundamental questions about humanity's place in a universe that was far more alive and interconnected than current science acknowledged. Jake, Bob continued, the beings who built those structures have been monitoring human development for thousands of years, waiting to see if we would develop the wisdom and cooperation necessary to join a galactic community of intelligent species. The technology we encountered wasn't just advanced, it was educational, designed to evaluate our readiness for contact with civilizations that exist on scales we can barely imagine. Are you telling me that you made contact with extraterrestrial intelligence? Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. Bob smiled at the question. After 50 years of carrying the secret alone, it felt almost liberating to finally see the wonder and terror in someone else's eyes. Jake, we made contact with an intelligence network so advanced that the term extraterrestrial doesn't even begin to capture what we encountered. The beings who created that installation weren't just from another planet. They were representatives of a community of consciousness that spans the entire galaxy, possibly the entire universe. A community of consciousness. Imagine intelligence that exists as pure information, consciousness that can inhabit and manipulate matter at will, beings who have transcended the limitations of individual biological existence to become part of a vast network of awareness that connects every advanced civilization in the cosmos, Bob explained. The installation we found on the moon wasn't just a communication device. It was an interface, a bridge between human consciousness and a form of existence that operates according to principles of reality we're still centuries away from understanding. Jake set down the photograph and leaned back in the booth, his engineering mind struggling to process concepts that challenged every assumption about physics, about consciousness, about the nature of intelligence itself. And this technology could solve the problems we're having with Mars life support systems. Jake, this technology could revolutionize human civilization overnight, Bob replied. The atmospheric processing systems you're trying to develop. Child's play compared to what we learned about manipulating matter and energy at the quantum level. Radiation shielding for Mars missions. Trivial when you understand how to adjust the fundamental properties of atomic structures. Communication delays between Earth and Mars. Non-existent when you're tapping into information networks that transcend the normal limitations of space and time. Then, why hasn't this technology been used? Jake demanded. If NASA has access to solutions that could solve every major challenge facing space exploration, why are we still struggling with problems that were supposedly solved 50 years ago? Bob's expression grew serious. Because the technology only activates for species that demonstrate certain characteristics: cooperation over competition, wisdom over aggression, respect for life over exploitation of resources, and the ability to think beyond tribal conflicts to the larger community of consciousness that exists throughout the universe. In 1971, humanity hadn't developed those characteristics. The question is whether we have them now. The restaurant had grown quiet around them as the dinner crowd thinned out, leaving Bob and Jake alone with the magnitude of what was being revealed. Jake was staring at his grandfather with a mixture of amazement and skepticism, his scientific training warring with the evidence of his own eyes and the sincerity in Bob's voice. "Grandpa," Jake said finally, "assuming for a moment that everything you're telling me is true, what does this have to do with my current work?" "Why are you telling me this now?" Bob leaned forward, his voice urgent with 50 years of suppressed knowledge. "Because your Mars mission isn't just another step in human space exploration, Jake. It's the trigger that will reactivate the network, the signal that will let the galactic community know that humanity is ready for the next phase of contact." "What do you mean?" The installation we found on the moon wasn't dormant, Bob explained. It was monitoring human development, waiting for us to reach certain technological and social milestones. The development of interplanetary colonization capabilities, the ability to establish permanent settlements beyond Earth, the demonstration of cooperation between nations in pursuit of common goals. These are the indicators that the network was designed to recognize. Jake's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. Are you saying that my Mars project will automatically trigger contact with this galactic intelligence network? I'm saying that it already has, Bob replied. The failures you're experiencing aren't random system breakdowns, Jake. They're part of an educational process designed to push human engineering beyond current limitations, to force you to develop the kind of integrated thinking that will be necessary for successful interaction with galactic-level technology. Bob paused, watching his grandson struggle with concepts that expanded the scope of human space exploration far beyond anything current NASA planning had considered. The beings who created this network don't just observe and evaluate developing species, Jake. They guide them. Every challenge you're facing with your life support systems is a lesson. Every failure is direction toward solutions that require you to think about technology, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of reality in completely new ways. You're saying that my equipment failures are being caused by alien intervention. I'm saying that your equipment failures are educational opportunities provided by intelligence that has been shepherding human development for centuries, Bob corrected. Every major breakthrough in human space technology, every innovation that brought us closer to interplanetary capability, was influenced by subtle information transfers from the network. The beings who created this system have been patiently guiding human civilization toward the point where we could join their community as equals rather than subjects. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what his grandfather was revealing. Finally, he asked, "What happens if I succeed? What happens if we solve the life support problems and successfully establish a permanent Mars colony?" Then humanity passes its final examination for membership in a galactic community that has been waiting centuries for us to be ready, Bob replied. The network fully activates. We gain access to technologies that will revolutionize human civilization, and we inherit the responsibility of helping to guide other developing species throughout the galaxy. And if we fail? Bob's expression grew somber. Then the network remains dormant, the contact opportunity passes, and humanity continues to develop in isolation. We'll eventually reach Mars and establish colonies using our own primitive technology, but we'll face every challenge alone, without guidance from civilizations that have already solved the problems we're trying to overcome. Jake picked up the mission patch again and studied it closely, as if the embroidered threads might reveal additional secrets about the most important mission in human history. Grandpa, if what you're telling me is true, then there are thousands of people working on Mars colonization who need to know what they're really working toward. That's exactly what I've been thinking, Bob said. For 50 years, I've watched brilliant minds struggle with problems that have solutions locked away in classified files and in the memories of 3 astronauts who swore to keep them secret. But Charlie and Kevin are dead now, and I'm the only one left who remembers what we learned during those 3 days on the far side of the moon. So what do we do? Bob smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that had been pressing down on him for half a century. We start by sharing this information with the key members of your Mars team. Carefully, gradually, with proper preparation for the implications of what they're learning. Then we begin the process of preparing humanity for contact with intelligence that has been patiently waiting for us to prove. We're ready to join the larger conversation of consciousness that connects every advanced species in the universe. Jake was nodding, his engineer's mind already beginning to work through the practical implications of what he was learning. The atmospheric processing problems I've been having, the integration challenges with biological and mechanical systems. If this galactic technology operates according to principles that transcend normal physics, then my current approach is fundamentally flawed. Not flawed, Bob corrected. Incomplete. You've been trying to solve 21st century problems with 21st century thinking, but the solutions require perspective that incorporates principles of consciousness, quantum mechanics, and galactic scale engineering that human science is only beginning to understand. Can you teach me? Jake asked. Can you share the specific technical knowledge that you gained during Apollo 21? Bob reached across the table and gripped his grandson's hand. Jake, I can do better than that. I can put you in direct contact with the source of that knowledge. What do you mean? The network that we encountered on Apollo 21 never shut down, Bob explained. It's been monitoring human development for 50 years, waiting for someone with the right combination of technical knowledge and openness to expanded thinking. Your failures with the Mars life support systems haven't been random. They've been communications, attempts by the network to establish contact with the human engineer who has the capability to understand what it's trying to teach. Jake stared at his grandfather with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. You're saying that this galactic intelligence network has been trying to communicate with me specifically? I'm saying that your work on Mars life support systems has identified you as humanity's most likely candidate for successful integration with galactic-level technology, Bob replied. The network has been studying your approaches, your failures, your innovations, waiting for the right moment to make direct contact. When? Bob smiled, remembering the exact feeling he had experienced 50 years ago when he first realized that human consciousness was capable of direct interface with technology that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. Tonight, Bob said, if you're ready. If you're willing to expand your thinking beyond the limitations of current human knowledge and open your mind to possibilities that will challenge everything you thought you knew about engineering, about consciousness, about humanity's destiny among the stars. Jake was quiet for a long moment, weighing the magnitude of what his grandfather was offering. Everything about his scientific training told him to be skeptical, to demand more evidence, to proceed cautiously with claims that seemed too extraordinary to be true. But everything about his intuition, everything about the pattern of failures he had been experiencing, everything about the feeling that his work was part of something much larger than Mars colonization, told him that his grandfather was revealing the most important truth in human history. What do I need to do? Jake asked finally. Bob stood up and left money on the table for their untouched dinner. We need to take a drive, he said. There's something I need to show you, something that's been waiting 50 years for the right person to see it. 30 minutes later, Bob was driving Jake through the back roads of rural Texas, heading toward a destination that didn't appear on any public maps. The conversation in the truck was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what was happening. For Bob, it was the culmination of 50 years of waiting, the moment when he could finally share the burden of knowledge that had defined his entire adult life. For Jake, it was the beginning of an adventure that would expand his understanding of engineering, of consciousness, and of humanity's place in a universe that was far more alive and interconnected than he had ever imagined possible. They drove for an hour through increasingly isolated countryside, past farms and ranch land that stretched endlessly under the Texas sky. Finally, Bob turned onto a dirt road marked only by a small sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." The road wound through several miles of scrub brush and mesquite trees before ending at a gate that looked like standard ranch fencing, but was actually reinforced with materials that would stop a military assault. Bob punched a code into a hidden keypad, and the gate swung open with the silence of well-maintained hydraulic systems. They drove another mile through seemingly empty rangeland before reaching a second gate, this one obviously high-tech, with cameras, motion sensors, and electromagnetic field generators that would disable any unauthorized electronic equipment. "Grandpa," Jake said, his voice filled with growing amazement, "what is this place?" "This is where we've been storing the physical artifacts from Apollo 21, Bob replied. "The equipment we brought back from the lunar installation, the samples we collected, the interface devices that allowed us to communicate directly with the network. For 50 years, Everything has been waiting here for someone with the capability to understand and utilize what we discovered. The second gate opened onto a facility that looked like a cross between a government research installation and something from science fiction. Low, modern buildings were scattered across several acres, connected by covered walkways, and surrounded by the kind of security systems that protected the most sensitive locations on Earth. But despite the high-tech surroundings, the place had an atmosphere of patient waiting, as if it had been designed to remain dormant until the right person arrived to awaken it. Bob parked in front of the main building and led Jake through a series of security checkpoints that included biometric scanners, DNA verification, and psychological evaluation systems that were clearly more advanced than anything in mainstream use. Finally, they entered an elevator that descended much deeper than the surface architecture had suggested possible. "How deep does this go?" Jake asked as the elevator continued its descent. "About 2 miles," Bob replied. "Deep enough to shield the installation from electromagnetic interference, seismic activity, and most forms of surveillance. The Apollo 21 artifacts require very specific environmental conditions to remain stable." The elevator opened onto a corridor that stretched into the distance, lined with doors that led to laboratories, storage facilities, and chambers whose purposes weren't immediately obvious. The air had a strange quality, almost crystalline in its clarity, and Jake could feel a subtle energy that seemed to resonate with something deep in his consciousness. "This way," Bob said, leading Jake down the corridor toward a door marked only with the symbol from the Apollo 21 mission patch. "Jake, before we go in there, I need you to understand something. What you're about to see will change you. Not just your understanding of engineering or space exploration, but your fundamental perception of reality, of consciousness, of what it means to be human in a universe filled with intelligence that operates on scales we're only beginning to imagine." Jake nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. "I'm ready, Grandpa." Bob opened the door, and they stepped into a chamber that took Jake's breath away. The room was enormous, with a domed ceiling that seemed to extend upward into infinity. Along the walls were display cases containing equipment that was clearly not of human manufacture, devices that seemed to be made of materials that shifted between solid and liquid states, control interfaces that responded to thought rather than touch, and artifacts that pulsed with their own internal light. But the center of the room was dominated by something that made Jake's engineering mind reel with possibilities. It was a perfect sphere, about 10 feet in diameter, hovering 3 feet above the floor without any visible means of support. The surface of the sphere was covered with patterns that flowed and shifted like living liquid, and Jake could feel it radiating an energy that seemed to penetrate every cell in his body. "That," Bob said, "is the communication interface we discovered in the lunar installation. For 50 years, it's been dormant, waiting for someone with the technical knowledge and openness of mind necessary to reactivate it." Jake approached the sphere slowly, feeling the energy emanating from it grow stronger with each step. As he got closer, the patterns on the surface began to shift more rapidly, and he could hear something that was almost like music, but operating on frequencies that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his consciousness. "Touch it," Bob said. "When you're ready, place your hands on the surface and open your mind to possibilities that go beyond everything you've been taught about the limitations of human knowledge." Jake reached out with trembling hands and placed his palms against the sphere's surface. The moment his skin made contact, the world exploded into light and awareness that transcended anything he had ever experienced. Information flooded into his consciousness, not just technical data about atmospheric processing and life support systems, but understanding that integrated engineering, consciousness, quantum mechanics, and galactic-scale awareness into a unified field of knowledge that redefined everything he thought he knew about reality. He saw the Mars colony as it was meant to be. Not just a human outpost on another planet, but a thriving ecosystem that demonstrated humanity's ability to create rather than merely consume, to foster life rather than exploit resources, to think beyond tribal limitations to the welfare of all consciousness throughout the universe. He understood that every challenge he had faced with his life support systems had been guidance from intelligence that had been patiently teaching him to think beyond the boundaries of current human science. Most importantly, he felt his consciousness expand beyond the limitations of individual identity to touch something vast and welcoming, a community of awareness that spanned galaxies and connected every intelligent species that had ever looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos. When Jake finally removed his hands from the sphere, he was no longer the same person who had entered the chamber. The knowledge that flooded his awareness had changed not just his understanding of engineering, but his perception of what it meant to be human in a universe that was far more alive and interconnected than Earth's civilization had ever imagined. "Now you know," Bob said, watching his grandson with the satisfaction of someone who had finally shared the most important secret of his life. "Now you understand what you're really working toward, and why the future of human civilization depends on your ability to succeed." Jake looked at his grandfather with eyes that now held awareness of realities that transcended everything he had learned in school, everything he had been taught about the limitations of human knowledge and possibility. "Grandpa," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder and determination, "let's go change the world." Bob smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that had been building inside him for 50 years. But as they stood in the chamber surrounded by technology that could revolutionize human civilization, he realized that Jake's transformation was only the beginning of a process that would need to unfold carefully, systematically, with proper preparation for the implications that extended far beyond individual understanding. "Jake," Bob said, "before we can change the world, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The interface you just experienced was just the introduction. The real education begins now." Over the next 3 hours, Bob led Jake through the entire Apollo 21 archive, revealing artifacts and information that had been classified at levels so high that most government officials didn't even know they existed. They examined equipment that had been brought back from the lunar installation, devices that operated according to principles of physics that human science was still centuries away from discovering independently. Jake studied crystalline storage devices that contained the complete technical specifications for atmospheric processing systems that could sustain entire ecosystems on planets with no natural atmosphere. He handled tools that manipulated matter at the quantum level, allowing users to restructure atomic bonds with the precision of thought itself. Most remarkably, he interfaced with what Bob called consciousness amplifiers, devices that expanded human awareness beyond the normal limitations of individual identity, allowing direct communication with the Galactic Intelligence Network. "The beings who created this technology," Bob explained, as Jake examined a device that looked like liquid metal shaped by pure intention, "don't think about engineering the way we do. For them, consciousness and matter are just different aspects of the same fundamental reality. They don't build machines, they grow tools that respond to awareness itself." Jake was beginning to understand why his conventional engineering approaches had been failing so consistently. He had been trying to solve problems with mechanical solutions, when the challenges were actually designed to push human thinking toward integration of consciousness, technology, and life itself. "This changes everything about the Mars project," Jake said, holding a device that his expanded awareness recognized as a biological-technological hybrid, capable of processing any planetary atmosphere into breathable air for any form of life. "We haven't been trying to build life support systems. We've been learning to think like galactic engineers." "Exactly," Bob replied. "And now that you understand what you're really working toward, we need to figure out how to share this knowledge with your team without causing panic, disbelief, or premature disclosure that could set back human development by decades." But as they stood in the underground chamber discussing the careful process of revelation that would be necessary to prepare humanity for galactic contact, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Red lights flashed along the corridors, and a computerized voice announced, "Attention! Unauthorized contact detected. External communication protocols activated. All personnel report to Central Command immediately." Bob's face went pale, In 50 years, those alarms had never sounded. Jake, something's happening. Something that wasn't supposed to happen until we were ready. They rushed to the central command center, where banks of monitors displayed information from listening stations around the globe. The screens showed signal patterns unlike anything in the normal spectrum of space communication. Structured, purposeful transmissions coming from the far side of the moon with increasing intensity and complexity. "It's the network," Bob said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Your contact with the interface has triggered a response. The galactic community knows that humanity has someone who can understand their communications." Jake studied the incoming signals, his consciousness now expanded enough to recognize patterns that would have been meaningless to him just hours earlier. "Grandpa, they're not just sending information, they're sending invitations, multiple frequencies, different types of intelligence, all trying to establish contact protocols." "How many different intelligences?" Jake concentrated on the signal analysis, his enhanced awareness processing information at rates that would have been impossible with normal human consciousness. "At least 47 distinct civilizations. Some biological, some digital, some that seem to exist as pure consciousness without physical form. And they're all connected through the same network we encountered on the moon." Bob sat down heavily in one of the command chairs, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being humanity's first contact with a galactic community. "Jake, we're not ready for this. I thought we would have months, maybe years to prepare. But your interface with the sphere has accelerated the timeline. The galactic community thinks we're ready for full contact." "Maybe we are," Jake said, his voice filled with confidence that came from direct connection with intelligence that spanned the cosmos. "Grandpa, during my interface with the sphere, I didn't just receive technical information. I experienced the perspective of civilizations that have successfully made the transition from planetary to galactic awareness. The process is challenging, but it's also natural, like a species reaching technological adolescence and joining the larger community of adult civilizations." But before Bob could respond, the central communication console activated itself, and a voice began speaking in perfect English with intonations that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. "Greetings, Robert Sterling and Jake Sterling. We have been waiting 57 years, 4 months, and 16 days for humanity to develop consciousness capable of receiving this communication." Jake and Bob stared at the console, realizing they were participating in the most significant moment in human history. First contact with galactic intelligence, happening not as dramatic arrival of alien spacecraft, but as natural progression of consciousness that had been guided and nurtured for generations. "We are what you call the network," the voice continued. "Not a single species, but a community of intelligences that have evolved beyond individual planetary limitations to become part of the larger conversation of awareness that connects all conscious life throughout the universe. Your species has reached the threshold where this conversation becomes possible. Are you the beings who built the installation on the moon?" Bob asked, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "We are descendants of the beings who established that interface," the voice replied. "What you encountered 57 years ago was an evaluation and education system designed to determine when your species would be ready for inclusion in the galactic community. Your grandson's recent interface with the consciousness amplifier has demonstrated that humanity has developed the awareness necessary for productive participation in our network." Jake leaned forward, his engineer's curiosity overriding any fear about the implications of the conversation. "What does participation in the network involve?" "Sharing knowledge, perspective, and resources with 47 other intelligent civilizations currently active in this region of the galaxy," the voice explained. "Your species brings unique perspectives on biological diversity, creative problem-solving, and emotional intelligence that complement the capabilities of other network members. In return, you gain access to technologies, wisdom, and opportunities for development that would take your species millions of years to achieve independently." "And the Mars colonization project?" Jake asked, Your Mars colony will become humanity's first contribution to the network, the voice replied. Not just a human outpost, but a demonstration of your species' ability to create thriving ecosystems that support diverse forms of life. The technologies you develop for Mars will be shared throughout the network, and the techniques developed by other civilizations will be made available to ensure your success. Bob was beginning to understand the true scope of what Jake's Mars project represented. So the entire human space program has been preparation for joining this galactic community. Every major development in human space exploration has been influenced by subtle guidance from the network, the voice confirmed. Your species has been shepherded toward this moment for centuries, but the choice to join our community must be made freely, with full understanding of the responsibilities and opportunities involved. What responsibilities? Jake asked. Each member civilization commits to fostering the development of other intelligent species within their sphere of influence, the voice explained. Earth's participation in the network would make humanity responsible for guiding the development of at least 17 other worlds in this galactic region that are currently approaching the threshold of interplanetary capability. The implications were staggering. Jake realized they were discussing not just humanity's next step into space, but Earth's transformation into a guiding intelligence for an entire region of galactic development. How long do we have to make this decision? Bob asked. The window of opportunity remains open for 1 Earth year, the voice replied. During that time, key members of your species must be educated about the network, prepared for the responsibilities of membership, and given the opportunity to demonstrate readiness for galactic-level cooperation. Jake Sterling's Mars project will serve as the practical examination of humanity's readiness. What happens if we're not ready? Jake asked. The network remains dormant for your species, and humanity continues to develop independently, the voice replied. Eventually, perhaps in several thousand years, another evaluation opportunity will arise. But the current window represents your species' optimal moment for joining the galactic community. Bob and Jake exchanged glances, both men realizing they were being asked to make decisions that would affect the entire future of human civilization. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to transform humanity from an isolated planetary species to an active participant in a community of intelligence that spanned the galaxy. We need to involve other people in this decision, Bob said. World leaders, scientists, philosophers, humanity's best minds need to understand what we're being offered. That process has already begun, the voice replied. 43 individuals around your planet have experienced spontaneous contact with the network during the past 24 hours. They include leaders in government, science, and spiritual development who have the wisdom and influence necessary to guide humanity through this transition. Jake realized that his grandfather's decision to reveal the Apollo 21 secret had triggered a cascade of events that was already reshaping human civilization. Who are these people? The director of the European Space Agency, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the chief scientists at NASA, MIT, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, spiritual leaders from major world religions, and philosophers whose work has demonstrated understanding of consciousness that transcends normal human limitations, the voice listed. Each has been given information appropriate to their role in preparing humanity for potential network membership. Bob felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The burden of keeping the Apollo 21 secret alone was finally lifted, but now humanity faced the challenge of making the most important decision in its history within the space of a single year. What do Jake and I need to do? Bob asked. Jake Sterling continues his Mars colonization work, but now with access to technologies that will ensure success, the voice replied. The Mars colony becomes humanity's demonstration project, proof of your species' ability to create life-sustaining communities that operate in harmony with natural systems. Robert Sterling serves as liaison between the network and human leadership, sharing the historical context of 57 years of guidance and evaluation. And if humanity chooses to join the network, then your species begins the most remarkable adventure in its history, the voice replied. access to technologies that will solve your energy, environmental, and resource challenges, participation in exploration and development projects that span multiple star systems, the opportunity to help guide other developing civilizations toward their own moments of galactic awareness. Jake was studying the signal patterns on the monitoring equipment, his enhanced consciousness recognizing the complex harmonies that connected dozens of different civilizations in real-time communication. This isn't just about technology, is it? It's about evolution, the evolution of consciousness from individual to galactic scale. Precisely, the voice confirmed. Every species that joins the network undergoes this transformation, expanding from planetary to galactic awareness while maintaining the unique perspectives and capabilities that make them valuable contributors to the larger community. How do we begin? Bob asked. You have already begun, the voice replied. Jake Sterling's consciousness has been enhanced to serve as a bridge between human and galactic awareness. Robert Sterling's 57 years of carrying the Apollo 21 knowledge has prepared him to serve as teacher and guide for other humans undergoing similar expansion. The Mars Project provides practical focus for demonstrating humanity's readiness for galactic cooperation. Over the next several hours, Jake and Bob received detailed briefings about the network, about the 47 civilizations that comprised the local galactic community, about the technologies and opportunities that would become available to humanity upon joining. They learned about civilizations that existed as pure energy, about worlds where consciousness and technology had merged into forms of existence that transcended anything in current human experience, about projects that involved the creation of new star systems designed to support billions of diverse life forms. Most importantly, they learned about humanity's unique contribution to the network. Among the 47 current member civilizations, humans were unusual in their combination of individual creativity, emotional depth, and biological diversity appreciation. These characteristics, which had sometimes seemed like weaknesses compared to the logical efficiency of other species, were actually valuable assets that could enhance the problem-solving capabilities of the entire network. Your species' tendency toward emotional decision-making, which you often view as irrational, actually provides perspective that purely logical civilizations find valuable, the network voice explained. Many of our most successful projects have benefited from the kind of intuitive leaps that characterize human thinking. As dawn approached on what had become the most important day in human history, Jake and Bob found themselves transformed not just by knowledge, but by awareness of possibilities that expanded the scope of human existence beyond anything their species had ever imagined. Jake, Bob said as they prepared to leave the underground facility, your Mars project is no longer just about establishing a human colony on another planet. It's about demonstrating that humanity is ready to become a gardener of life throughout the galaxy. I understand, Grandpa, Jake replied, his consciousness now expanded to encompass perspectives that integrated individual human awareness with galactic-scale intelligence. And I'm ready. We're going to show the universe that humanity deserves a place in this community. But as they drove back through the Texas countryside toward Houston, both men knew that the real work was just beginning. 57 years of secret knowledge was about to become the foundation for the most dramatic transformation in human history, and the success of that transformation would depend on humanity's ability to expand from planetary to galactic consciousness, while maintaining the unique characteristics that made Earth's civilization worth, including in the larger community. 3 weeks later, Jake Sterling stood in the main laboratory of NASA's Johnson Space Center, surrounded by Mars colonization equipment that was finally working perfectly. The atmospheric processing systems that had failed hundreds of times now operated with efficiency that exceeded all theoretical projections. Radiation shielding systems provided protection levels that should have been impossible with current materials science. Most remarkably, the biological integration systems were creating closed-loop ecosystems that could sustain not just human life, but entire communities of diverse organisms in environments completely hostile to Earth-based life. The transformation had been remarkable, But it hadn't been easy. Jake's enhanced consciousness had to be integrated with normal human awareness in ways that allowed him to communicate with colleagues who hadn't experienced galactic contact. He had to find ways to explain revolutionary breakthroughs without revealing the source of his new understanding. Most challenging, he had to lead a team of brilliant engineers and scientists who were struggling to understand how their previous failures had suddenly become unprecedented successes. "Jake," said Dr. Maria Santos, the Mars Project's biological systems specialist, "I've been reviewing the data from our latest atmospheric processing tests, and I can't explain what's happening. These systems are operating according to principles that don't exist in any textbook. It's almost like they're alive, responding to conditions with intelligence rather than just following programmed parameters." Jake smiled, remembering his grandfather's explanation of galactic technology that integrated consciousness with matter. "Maria, what if they are alive, in a sense? What if we've stumbled onto engineering approaches that work with natural intelligence rather than trying to control it? That would revolutionize everything we think we know about technology," Maria replied. "But if you're right, then we're not just building machines, we're creating partners." "Exactly," Jake said, pleased that his colleague was beginning to understand concepts that would be essential for successful integration with galactic engineering principles. "And if we can demonstrate that capability on Mars, we might be ready for challenges we haven't even imagined yet." Jake had been authorized to begin gradually expanding his team's awareness of the larger context of their work. Not full disclosure of galactic contact. That would come later, when humanity had demonstrated readiness for that level of information. But introduction to concepts that would prepare them for the revelation that their Mars project was part of something much more significant than establishing a human outpost on another planet. "Maria," Jake said, "what would you think if I told you that our Mars colony might serve as a model for life support systems that could work on dozens of different worlds throughout the galaxy?" Maria stared at him with the expression of someone whose scientific worldview was being gently challenged. "I'd say that sounds like science fiction, but considering what we've accomplished in the past 3 weeks, maybe science fiction is becoming science fact." "Keep that attitude," Jake advised. "Because the next phase of our work is going to require thinking that goes beyond everything we learned in school." Across Houston, Bob Sterling was having similar conversations with carefully selected NASA leadership, gradually introducing concepts that would prepare the organization for the most important revelation in human history. His approach was patient, methodical, designed to expand awareness without causing panic or disbelief that could derail the delicate process of preparing humanity for galactic contact. But the most significant conversations were happening at levels far above NASA. The 43 individuals who had experienced spontaneous network contact were meeting in secure locations around the world, sharing information and coordinating humanity's response to the opportunity for galactic membership. In Geneva, the Secretary General of the United Nations was meeting with world leaders who had been briefed on the network contact, discussing the implications of humanity's potential transformation from a planetary to a galactic species. In Beijing, Moscow, Washington, and Brussels, government officials were quietly reviewing classified reports about technologies that could solve energy, environmental, and resource challenges that had seemed insurmountable just weeks earlier. Most remarkably, in religious centers around the world, spiritual leaders were finding that the prospect of contact with galactic intelligence enhanced rather than challenged their understanding of humanity's place in a universe filled with consciousness and purpose. "The network's message is completely consistent with teachings about the interconnectedness of all consciousness," said Cardinal Martinez during a private meeting at the Vatican. "If anything, galactic contact confirms that the universe is far more alive and spiritually meaningful than we ever dared to hope." Rabbi Cohen, speaking at a closed session in Jerusalem, agreed. "The idea that consciousness connects all intelligent life throughout the galaxy doesn't contradict our understanding of divine purpose. It expands that understanding to scales we couldn't previously imagine." The Dalai Lama, meeting with Buddhist leaders in Dharamshala, observed, This contact represents the natural evolution of compassion from individual to planetary to galactic scale. Humanity is being invited to participate in the liberation of consciousness throughout the universe. These conversations were happening simultaneously across Earth, as humanity's best minds began the process of understanding that their species was being offered membership in a community of intelligence that spanned the galaxy. But not everyone was ready for such a dramatic expansion of human awareness. Leaked reports about unusual NASA activities, about mysterious meetings among world leaders, about technologies that seemed to violate known laws of physics, began generating conspiracy theories and public anxiety that threatened to complicate the careful process of preparing humanity for galactic contact. Jake found himself at the center of this growing tension when a journalist named Rebecca Torres began investigating the sudden breakthrough in Mars colonization technology. "Dr. Sterling," Torres said during an unexpected visit to his NASA laboratory, "I've been reviewing patent applications, technical publications, and budget allocations related to your Mars project, and I can't find any research pathway that explains your recent successes. 3 weeks ago, your atmospheric processing systems were failing consistently. Now they're operating at efficiency levels that shouldn't be possible with current technology." What changed? Jake had been prepared for this moment, briefed by his grandfather and the network on how to handle media attention without compromising the delicate process of human preparation for galactic contact. "Rebecca," Jake said, "sometimes breakthrough happens when you stop trying to force solutions and start listening to what the problems are trying to teach you. Our recent successes came from changing our approach from controlling natural processes to working with them." "That sounds like philosophy, not engineering," Torres replied. "Can you show me the specific technical innovations that enabled these breakthroughs?" Jake led Torres through his laboratory, showing her equipment that was clearly more advanced than anything in mainstream use, but explaining the innovations in terms that emphasized human creativity rather than external assistance. "The key insight was integration," Jake explained as Torres examined an atmospheric processor that seemed to be operating according to principles that transcended normal chemistry. Instead of trying to build separate systems for air, water, and biological processing, we developed integrated approaches that mimic the way natural ecosystems maintain themselves. "And you developed these approaches independently?" Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. The truth about network assistance couldn't be revealed until humanity was better prepared, but he also couldn't lie to someone whose job was uncovering important stories. "Let's say we had inspiration from sources that haven't been widely recognized in mainstream engineering," Jake said. "Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from being open to perspectives that go beyond conventional thinking." Torres was clearly suspicious, but she was also impressed by what she saw in Jake's laboratory. The equipment was undeniably revolutionary, and the Mars colonization project was achieving results that would ensure humanity's successful expansion beyond Earth. "Dr. Sterling," Torres said finally, "I think you're working with technologies that are more advanced than anything the public knows about. I don't know where they came from, but I can see that they're real, and they're going to change everything about human space exploration." "You're absolutely right," Jake agreed, "but I hope you'll be patient with the process of revelation. Some stories are too important to rush, and this one needs to be told carefully, with proper preparation for the implications." Torres nodded, recognizing that she was touching the edge of something that extended far beyond normal science journalism. "How long before the full story can be told?" Jake smiled, thinking about the network's timeline for humanity's decision about galactic membership. "Within the year, Rebecca. Within the year, the whole world will understand what we're really working toward." As Torres left his laboratory, Jake realized that the careful process of preparing humanity for galactic contact was accelerating beyond anyone's control. The technologies were too revolutionary to keep secret, the implications too significant to contain within government and scientific circles. But perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps humanity was ready for the truth about its place in a universe filled with intelligence, consciousness, and opportunities that transcended everything the species had ever imagined possible. That evening, Jake called his grandfather to discuss the growing public interest in their work. "Grandpa," Jake said, "I think the time for secrecy is ending. People are beginning to figure out that something extraordinary is happening, and we're going to have to decide how to tell the whole story." "I've been thinking the same thing," Bob replied. 57 years of secrecy was necessary to protect humanity until we were ready. But now that we're approaching readiness, continuing to hide the truth might actually slow down the process of preparation. So what do we do? Bob was quiet for a moment, considering the magnitude of the decision they were facing. "We tell the truth, Jake. We tell the world about Apollo 21, about the network, about the choice humanity is being offered. Not all at once, not without careful preparation, but we begin the process of revelation that will prepare our species for the most important decision in its history. And if people aren't ready, if the revelation causes panic or disbelief, then we deal with those challenges as they arise," Bob said. "But I think you'll be surprised by how ready people actually are. 57 years of science fiction, of space exploration, of gradual expansion of human awareness have prepared our species for this moment more than we realize." As Jake ended the conversation with his grandfather, he looked out at the Houston skyline and imagined a future where Earth was connected to a galactic community of intelligence that spanned the stars. The challenges ahead were enormous, but so were the opportunities. Humanity stood at the threshold of the greatest adventure in its history. And Jake Sterling, grandson of the last surviving Apollo 21 astronaut, was ready to help his species take the next step into a universe that was far more welcoming and alive than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The secret that had been kept for 57 years was about to transform into humanity's invitation to join the stars.